Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gianna Signorelli. I'm currently working towards my master's in applications of data science here at Bay Path University. And today I'm going to be presenting my capstone project. So let's get into it. So today I'm going to be discussing NFL lower body injuries, investigating specifically the relationship between playing surface and player injury. So today we're going to be introducing the problem, the background to the problem, and the motivation behind this project. The goal of this project, presenting the data set we're going to be using for analysis, data preparation and cleaning, present our exploratory analysis, and then model building in our data analysis. We'll go over the results and present next steps and recommendations for the future. So I want to ask the question, why analyze player injuries and player performance in the NFL? What is the motivation behind this topic? So for me personally, I do have an aspiring career in sports analytics. I've always wanted to study specifically sports analytics and football. And I think as football fans, one thing we can all agree on is that one of the hardest things, if not the hardest, to watch during NFL games is players suffering injuries. One of the major issues in the NFL right now is ensuring player safety, as player injuries have definitely been occurring at a catastrophic rate. Players have been retiring at incredibly early ages due to injury, or they're simply left on injured reserve status for weeks at a time. And many of these players, worst of all, are left with lifelong medical issues that'll affect them for years to come. So we know that injuries have always been prevalent in football, as of course it is a violent sport, but I believe that with today's technological advancements and analytical developments, that we have a responsibility to try and minimize injury as much as possible. So I've included a couple of photos here, a couple of examples in the 2022 regular season, as well as the Super Bowl that was held in 2022 prior to the start of the 2022 season. So on the left, I've shown Odell Beckham Jr.'s knee injury that was endured during the Super Bowl. And on the right, we see Emmanuel Moseley from the San Francisco 49ers suffering a torn ACL in the 2022 regular season. Again, another example of non-contact lower body injury. The purpose of including these photos is what's very important to mention is that both of these injuries were endured. Both of these injuries that were endured were non-contact lower extremity injuries that happened on artificial turf fields. So this is definitely grown to be a large cause for concern amongst NFL players when it comes to injuries, enduring injuries on artificial turf more than natural grass. So our problem at hand. As I mentioned, the topic of great debate has been whether the risk of lower body injury rate is higher on artificial turf versus natural grass. And we're also concerned with what some other major factors are contributing to the lower body injuries in the NFL. So out of right now, the 30 NFL stadiums, 16 use natural grass, while the remaining 14 use artificial turf. And why are so many franchises switching to artificial turf? Well, with artificial turf, there's little to no maintenance needed and throughout its entire lifespan. And as compared to grass, it's very high maintenance. It needs to be taken care of on a weekly basis in the NFL. And artificial turf also prevents any major maintenance issues from arising during a game or in the middle of the season, which is very important since a large majority of the season is spent playing on the field. So any maintenance issues that could occur could slow some things down. There's also been a large growth of investigations on lower body injuries at the NFL as they relate to playing surface. Due to the rise in non-contact injuries in the NFL over the last few years, during these investigations, they've noticed notably higher injury rates on artificial turf compared with natural grass. An example of one of these studies that was conducted it was presented in The Athletic in 2022. It was found that natural grass will eventually give, which releases the player's cleat prior to reaching an injurious load. But then on synthetic surfaces, there is less give, which means that players' feet, ankles, and knees absorb that force, which makes injuries much more likely to happen. So, how has the NFL approached this issue thus far? In the last decade, as I mentioned, there's been many injury investigations conducted throughout the league, which have led to many advancements in ensuring player safety, which is a great sign in the right direction. Some examples of these I've listed here, one being Field Surface Safety and Performance Committee. This committee was created by the NFL and the NFL Players Association in 2016 to perform research on injuries and to use this research to advise on injury prevention, improve testing methods, and adopt new methods to evaluate field surface performance. They also oversee the NFL Stadium Inspection Program. This program is a testing of NFL playing surfaces by engineers actually retained by the NFL, and it's also under observation by NFL Players Association experts. The NFL is also using data analysis techniques to ensure optimal player safety. Through these techniques, they collect data on every move a player makes through sources like equipment sensors, radio frequency ID tags, and even video analysis. These types of techniques allow us to better understand, when, where, and how player injuries are occurring. Then we can then use this data to better understand injuries, build models that can predict when they'll most likely occur, and which will then help us avoid them in the future. They've also used these results to enforce rule changes that can help avoid risky behavior, which can lead to injuries. And lastly, biomechanical studies have been conducted on football cleat surface interactions. Studies have shown that synthetic surfaces do not release cleats as readily as natural turf, as I mentioned a couple slides ago. This may contribute to incidents of non-contact lower limb injuries, which is definitely something that we want to look into. So there has been a debate for natural grass versus artificial turf throughout the last decade. So to give you a little bit of a timeline, throughout the years 2012 through 2020, the NFL union president, J.C. Tretter is his name. He did note that injury rate on grass surfaces was lower from 2012 to 2020 as compared to synthetic surfaces. And according to a 2019 American Journal of Sports Medicine study, playing on artificial turf increases the risk of lower body injuries, and field surface actually has a causal effect on injury rates due to synthetic turf's lack of ability to release an athlete's shoe. So there was definitely a cause for concern. Then in 2021, Jeff Miller, the NFL's Executive Vice President of Communications, Public Affairs, and Policy, issued a response to this. He believed that 2021 injury rates for turf and grass were essentially the same this year. So because of this, he agreed that the lower extremity injury rates between natural grass and synthetic surfaces over the past few years basically had decreased to a point where they were non-existent. So there wasn't a difference between injuries on synthetic surfaces and natural grass surfaces. So according to Miller, this trend meant that the discussion between the synthetic versus natural was not an argument and we should try to decrease injuries on both surfaces, essentially. We shouldn't be focusing as much on synthetic surfaces, but we should focus on both. Then in 2022, J.C. Tretter, the union president, responded again after we received the results for 2022. He called this outcome in 2021 an outlier because 2022 brought us the same results that we had gotten prior in the years of 2012 to 2020. According to that data provided by the NFL Players Association, a 2023 ESPN article reported that non-contact injuries for NFL players occurred at a higher rate on artificial turf compared with grass in the 2022 regular season. So you could say this proves that 2021 was in fact an outlier, and there is a real issue here. So I included this. This was a study done by Dr. Casey Reynolds in 2020. I thought it was very important to include this diagram because we should be asking for player input. The players are the ones who are enduring these injuries. And I think it's important to incorporate their input for what they think is more dangerous. So some big statistics to mention: 64.4% of NFL players think that artificial turf is more likely to negatively affect their quality of life after football. 82.4% of the players think that the artificial turf is more likely to contribute to injuries. 89.1% of players think that the turf causes more soreness and fatigue. And lastly, 89.7% of NFL players think that turf is more likely to shorten their career. All in all, in general, I think this sums up the argument coming from players that they agree that artificial turf can be more dangerous and more high risk to injuries than natural grass can be. So then my question becomes, should NFL analysts focus more on investigating the relationship between injury and playing surface, so turf versus grass, or should we be analyzing the contributing factors to injury on both surfaces, like Jeff Miller stated? So this brings me to my goal. How can we minimize injuries overall? I'm going to during this project, we want to evaluate the relationship between severity of injury and playing surface, determine the association between severity of injury and all the other variables in our data set, and build a predictive model to help assess the contributing factors to injuries, and use this model to make recommendations for minimizing non-contact lower body injuries. So for our data set, I was able to utilize an existing data set provided by a Kaggle analytics competition in 2020 called NFL First and Future Analytics. This competition provided, and this data was also provided by Next Gen Stats. It provided 3 CSV files that includes information on 105 player in-game histories from 2 consecutive NFL regular seasons. They don't provide the exact seasons, but due to a couple details with the data, we can assume that it was within the last couple of years. So the important thing to emphasize is this is injury data. So every individual included in this data was injured. There were no non-injured participants. The 3 files provided are below in the table. The 2 that I'm going to be utilizing for my analysis are the injury records, which are information about the injuries that occurred, and the play file that includes game, field, and play information at the player play level during these injuries. So the first data set the first file that I'm going to be using called injury records. This file contains information on 105 lower limb injuries that occurred during those 2 regular seasons. There's 105 observations and 9 variables here. The player injuries can be linked to specific records in a player history using those key variables that are bolded: player key, game ID, and play key, those fields. The remaining variables: body part, what part of the body was injured; surface, synthetic surface versus natural grass surface. And then the remaining 4 variables, the DM underscore variables. These variables represent days missed after an injury. So for example, days DM underscore M1, 1 day was missed post-injury. Same thing for 7 days, 28 days, and 42 days. The play file. This file contains the details for 267,005 player plays that make up the data set. So there were 267,005 observations and 14 columns and variables. Again, the details about the plays, including these details about the plays, can also be indexed with the injury records data set using the key variables player key, game ID, and play key. The details about the game include players assigned roster position, the player day, the day that it happened, the player game, the game that it happened, stadium type, field type, temperature, weather, play type, what type of play that they were in the middle of, the player gameplay, what type of play in the game, position, and position group. So we definitely needed to do some data cleaning here with the play file data. I started with this data set because it was a little bit messier than the injury records and a lot bigger than the injury records. So I definitely wanted to clean this one up. For the temperature variable, I found that there were some influential points and outliers in the temperature data. Some were very low, below 0 temps. So I chose to remove the outliers for the analysis. For the stadium type variable, I found that there were many duplicates in the data. For example, there were a couple of different spellings of the word outdoor, our door, outdoor roof open. So what I did is I grouped and defined some new categorical groups: outdoor, indoor closed, and indoor open for those top 3 categories. And similar to stadium type, weather type also had some duplicates in the data. So what I did is grouped and defined some new categorical groups as well for this one. We have rain, clear, overcast, controlled climate, and snow. So for the injury records data, we also did a little bit of cleaning here, particularly with the body part variable. From our initial visualizations of this variable, we did see that the most injuries consisted of knee and ankle injuries, followed by foot, toes, and heel data. So what we did was, since the foot, toes, and heel injuries were very few in number compared to the rest, knee and ankle injuries, I grouped them into one category and named this category other prior to analysis. Another variable I chose to clean up was the days missed binary variables. So the number of days out due to injury, I assumed that this indirectly portrayed the severity of the injury because, of course, the more days that you're out, the worse the injury. So I created the severity variable with the scale level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Level 1 being the least serious, which would be the DM underscore M1, and then same for DM M7 and M28 and M42. 1 being the least serious, 4 being the most severe. And then once I cleaned up both data sets, I combined the playlist data and injury records data into one data file. As we can see on the right here, this is the picture of the severity levels. We definitely didn't have as much data for injuries that were level 3 as opposed to all the other injuries. So that's something I'll have you keep in mind prior to the analysis here. So we started our exploratory analysis. And the first thing I wanted to see, due to the background of this project and the motivation behind it, was the distribution for natural surfaces versus synthetic. So here we can see there were 48 natural surface games and 57 synthetic. So I wanted to further evaluate the surface variable. So these visuals here, on the left, we can see the surface as it compares to type of injury, body part. And on the right, we can see surface and severity type of injury. So as surface compares to how severe the injuries is. So to take a look at the severity of injuries on synthetic surfaces, I can see that the synthetic surfaces appear worse when compared with the severity of injuries on a natural surface. More specifically, synthetic surface has a greater share at severity levels 1, 3, and 4, but especially at level 3, 28 days missed. I do hypothesize that playing surface does have an association with how severe injury is, level 1 being the least severe and level 4 being the most severe, just from some of my initial observations of the data. So this was a very interesting visual that I saw during my exploratory analysis here. So as you can see, the top shows games played on the synthetic turf, and or it shows the games played on synthetic turf versus natural grass. 58% of the games in our data were played on natural grass. And then on the bottom, we have number of injuries by surface, which is quite interesting because synthetic surfaces, although there was less games played on synthetic surface, it does have slightly more injuries in absolute terms here, which is a cause for concern because if there's less games played on synthetic surfaces, why are there more injuries occurring on synthetic surfaces? So the assumption that there's a relationship between playing surface and severity of injury appears to be correct here. There appears to be an influence of surface on the severity levels. So what are some of our key takeaways so far? We have found that although more games were played on natural surfaces, more injuries are occurring on synthetic than natural. And also when we look at the surface role in severity, it does appear initially that synthetic surface does have an upper hand over natural surface. So here we get into our model building and data analysis. So the first thing to mention, our data selection. As I mentioned prior, the data selection includes injury records alone. So here our focus shifts to evaluating the relationship between the injuries themselves and the contributing factors, as opposed to evaluating the risk of someone getting injured or not. We're purely going to be focusing on injuries here, specifically the severity level of injuries. So then what we're looking to do is build a model with the severity as my target Y variable. At this point, I would like to build a model with severity as my target variable to better understand and identify some key factors behind severity of injuries. So we're going to be using two different techniques here. The first being multiple linear regression, and the second being the machine learning algorithm random forest model. Another important thing to mention is the removal of unnecessary key variables. So those three key variables that were bolded in the slides for the data: player key, game ID, and play key. These key variables are not of interest to us for this analysis. So by removing these unneeded variables, it'll make it a little easier to focus on the variables that could be significantly associated with player injuries. And then the topic of model interpretation. So probably one of the most important parts of this analysis is the model interpretation. I'm most interested in the model interpretation Although the results of the models are very important, our models here don't necessarily have to do well in our analysis. We are most interested in interpreting the model and the relationships between variables. We want to better understand the injuries. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a successful model at first. In other words, any result here is a valuable result. As the more answers we get, the better. The NFL in general needs more detailed information to be able to better differentiate between injury types. So that is what we're going to be most focused on throughout this analysis. I wanted to briefly review the two models we're going to be using here, or building rather. So the first on the left is a visual of a multiple linear regression model. So just to review, a multiple linear regression is a statistical technique that uses two or more independent variables to predict the outcome of a dependent variable. And we go to our random forest. The random forest, again, is a supervised machine learning algorithm that grows and combines multiple decision trees to create a quote unquote forest. This can be used for both classification and regression problems. For this study, we're going to be using it with classification. So our first model that we're going to be building is the multiple linear regression model. I used the RStudio programming tool to build this model. We're using all the variables in the combined data set, minus those key variables that we removed prior to analysis. And our target variable is going to be severity here. I gave a brief summary of the results of the model before going into the different interpretations of it. As you can see, the residual standard error, it's a lower value, which is what we want because this means the model fits the data well. And for the R-squared value, the higher value closer to 1 indicates that a large proportion of the variability of the outcome has been explained by the regression model. So we can say it did not perform bad. It's kind of somewhere in the middle here. And again, we're more focused on the model interpretation as opposed to the residuals here. So using the model summary, I was able to evaluate the coefficient values of the variables in the model to then assess relationships to severity. And there were some very interesting details to note here. Most importantly being surface variable, synthetic versus natural surface. We saw that synthetic surface had a more significant association to severity than the natural surface, which goes along with what we've been hearing and the background to similar investigations that have been conducted prior. For the position variable, what I found was the running back position was most associated with higher severity levels, so more severe injuries, immediately followed by the safety position. This, in my opinion, would definitely make sense because in both of these positions, players are making a lot of quick, short changes in motion and weight distribution. In both practices, games, the players are doing a lot of route mapping and cutting maneuvers, so to say. So in addition, running backs also get hit the most on the field, and safeties are constantly trying to mirror wide receiver routes, which is also, again, lots of quick changes in motion and weight distribution, which, as we know, can definitely lead to lower body injuries here. And our body part variable. So body part surprisingly had the most significant association with the severity of injury. And I say surprisingly, but after thinking about it, it definitely made sense to me because depending on where you are injured, could definitely predict how severe the injury may be. So for example, knee injuries have potential to be more severe than toe injuries. And lastly, our weather and stadium type variables. I found that outdoor was the most significant association amongst all stadium types, which also makes sense. When you're playing outside, you're definitely subject to different weather conditions such as rain, snow, as opposed to indoor stadiums where you are able to avoid risky weather conditions. And according to the model, we also found that controlled climate was more significant than any other weather type, which I did not expect. I figured it would be rain or snow, but it was definitely an interesting find. And I had some added variable plots here for you to see the regression for each variable. And then we moved on to our random forest model. For random forest, I also use the RStudio programming tool. And again, we're using all the variables in the combined data set, and we're using the severity variable as our target Y variable. The nature of the variable is important to mention, since severity has 4 levels based on severity of injury, 1, 2, 3, 4. I use the random forest model in R for classification to assess the predictability for the severity variable. So to predict the level of severity that the injury would be. And I also included a results summary here. And you can see the out of bag error, 75.71%. So this means our model accuracy is around 24.3%, which is not great, but not terrible. As a reminder, we don't need the models to do well here. We're focused more on interpreting the model to gather more information on the importance of the variables in the model. And as you can see in the confusion matrix, there is that imbalance of the severity levels, only 7 observations of level 3 injury. By presenting imbalanced data to this classifier, it can produce undesirable results. So that's important to mention when looking at these results. If I did have the opportunity and more time to continue working on this project, I would definitely personally work to gather more balanced data in terms of injury severity. I would want to make sure I had more of a balanced level of data for each severity level of injury. So I've included a couple plots here for you all. On the left, we can see the plot of the test mean squared error based on the number of trees used. And on the right, we can see the variable importance plot, which displays the importance of each predictor variable in the model. As we know, the higher the value of mean decrease accuracy, so that mean decrease Gini score, the higher the importance of the variable in the model. I did think these results were quite interesting, actually, after exploring the variables so far. From the plot, we can see that player gameplay, which this variable, to remind you again, is the variable denoting the running count of plays that the player has participated in during that game. So this was the most important predictor variable in this model. Considering this variable, and considering these results, it did make sense to me that it would be the most important, as the more plays you're a part of, the more time you spend playing, and the more likely you are to get injured. Also, the more time you spend playing, the higher the risk of getting a severe injury as opposed to a minor injury. Also, position and body part, I was taking a look at where they were placed in the importance, and they're still in the middle range here. And then surface and field type are actually near the bottom. So after seeing these results, I definitely had some recommendations for next steps. The most important being, we need more data. So again, this data was injury records alone. We didn't have any non-injured players. We only had injuries. So this makes it hard to predict injury. We're focusing on the severity of injury. So I would definitely be interested in researching the predictability for injury. So non-injury versus injury. And again, there was a data imbalance here. So for that severity target Y variable, again, the one that was originally coded with days missed. As I discussed in the random forest model, there was an imbalance with these because there was only 7 observations of level 3 injury, so 28 days missed. If I did have more time to continue working with this data, I would definitely ensure that it was balanced, and the categories of severity being our target variable, we want it to be balanced. And in order to best evaluate the relationships and predict injury severity in the future, we would need more data. And lastly, player information. If we could get player information like players' mass, age, height, etc., I believe it could help assess more of the physics surrounding the injury. So we could see if this information affects the severity of the injury at all. And also, I would be interested in knowing the shoe cleat type. So what types of cleats are players wearing? Do they have an effect on injuries, certain shoes versus others? And with this valuable information, and more information to be exact, we could use clustering on the players' profiles to identify similarities for both injured and non-injured players. So is there similarities between players of similar mass and height versus others? Same thing with shoes and cleat type. I'd definitely be interested in analyzing similarities in that case. And then, so I definitely had some recommendations also for particular variables that we were taking a look at. Surface here, so synthetic versus natural surface. Throughout the exploratory analysis and model building stages, we did see that even though more games were played on natural surfaces, more injuries were occurring on synthetic surfaces. So not only this, but specifically through our regression analysis, we found that when we look at surface roll in the severity, it appears that synthetic surface had the upper hand. So with that being said, I do have to agree with NFL Union President J.C. Tretter in that grass is significantly safer than turf here. So for my recommendation, considering the results and the player's perspective, especially on this issue, I believe that field surface should be uniform throughout the NFL. And hopefully all should be natural grass. But more importantly, they should be used to playing on the same field all the time. And I know there's also potential challenges that come with trying to change all the turf fields back to natural grass. I'm aware that challenges could come with this recommendation. Examples being, there definitely could be cost challenges to replacing the turf, and it may take a lot of time to make all the fields uniform. And lastly, there would definitely be maintenance challenges. Given the maintenance advantages of synthetic turf, keeping up with the grass would be a little bit more of a job, but I think the priority should be player safety, despite these challenges. So grass would be the way to go. And for data analysis, I would recommend that to focus more on synthetic surfaces, I would like to collect more data on specific types of synthetic surfaces. So are they the same type? Are they the same, like what generation of synthetic turf are they? I would be curious to know if different types have a different effect on player injuries. If one is worse than others, then maybe we would not have to get rid of all of the synthetic fields, only select types that are producing negative results. So this could also save us some money and time. For the position variable, I wanted to stress that in our analysis, again, we found that running back and safety positions were most associated with severe injuries. We discussed why these findings made sense in terms of the nature of those two positions. I would recommend that we focus on studying the interaction movements of those positions and that are not getting injured more often than others. So the positions like running back and safety, the ones that are having more severe injuries, let's take a look into the interaction movements and when they're injured, especially. For data analysis here, I have a couple of recommendations, a couple of which are already being done, but I'm going to emphasize the importance of these techniques. Since the NFL has started to use video recording for data collection and analysis, I think that we should collect more image and video data from players in high-risk positions as well. We can use this to assess player movements prior to their injury. And with this information, I would like to use it to build models that can predict the risk of player injury based on given particular movements and or situations that they're in, being in those positions. And lastly, for weather and stadium type variables. Although we found that controlled climate in outdoor stadiums led to more severe injuries, I do understand that these variables are not something that can be controlled easily. So that being said, what I believe programs can do is mimic these conditions during training, during practice, which can hopefully help players prepare for these conditions accordingly. So, in other words, if you have a stadium that is indoors and you have a game coming up for an outdoor stadium, and your stadium can open and close, I would say practicing inside would not best prepare the player for a game that's going to be outside. So preparing for the game, I think the best thing to do is mimic those situations to get the employees, or excuse me, the athletes in the right headspace to be able to go play on those surfaces. And then I think I would like to know a code for specific stadiums. I know this data also would most likely have to be anonymous, but I would like to know if more injuries are occurring at particular venues over others. Then, knowing this information, I think we could compare the attributes of different venues and determine potential risk factors for injury. Are injuries occurring more at other venues than others? It's different. I think it's important to look into that as well. So to conclude here, I want to thank all of you so much for listening. And I really hope you took some important things away from this presentation. I believe there's a vital need for improvement in terms of minimizing player injuries in the NFL. Again, it's gotten to a catastrophic rate, and I think it's a very serious issue. I'm glad though that the NFL is taking steps in the right direction, utilizing data science techniques to evaluate player injuries and help them avoid them in the future. Again, my name is Gianna Signorelli. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or link on Canvas, an inbox on Canvas, and I'd be happy to start a discussion. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.